Okay, for those of you joining us on the pre-recorded session, welcome to Week 12 Montana Government Studies Seminar. We're going to do the screen share thing, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to uncheck that, and there we go. And I'm going to click that, and there's that there. All right. Maybe. There we go. Now we're cooking with gas. There we go. So announcements for this week. Don't forget that the Unit 3 reading guide is due tomorrow. You do have the grace period till Wednesday, but as I state every time, don't live in that grace period. That is just inviting disaster. You wait till the last minute and something comes up and you can't submit on time, and that's the ball game. So get it in early, folks. End of the grace period for current event number 3 was yesterday. So completion data is in the course now for those. I just checked it right before we started this session. So that is up to date. I'm going to start putting those actual scores in later today, probably after the U.S. history session this afternoon. So today and tomorrow, we'll be looking for that score to go in. If you didn't turn it in, womp womp. Test on Unit 3 will open next week, so be sure to get that done. I need to take a look at it and see how long it is. I'm not recalling how long this one is, to see what the time limit's gonna be. I'm thinking probably 90 minutes for your attempt. And just bear in mind, I'm still getting folks that are trying to leave and come back, or they'll click start attempt and then they'll, I don't know, forget they started the attempt and they go away and it runs you out of time. Maybe one time in 100 it pauses when you click out of the test. The rest of the time your clock keeps on going, and I can't reopen attempts that have lapsed. All I can do is delete them and have you start over. So if you did say half the test and then decided you had to leave, then you might have to redo everything you'd previously done. So just as you're planning next week, map out a chunk of time. Like I said, I'm thinking it'll be 90 minutes, but I will post that on the test. When you click on it, it'll say you will have X amount of time to take this. Map out that chunk of time where you're not going to be disturbed. Leave your phone outside where you're testing. Not because I'm worried about you necessarily cheating, but that way you're not distracted. Somebody doesn't text you and you get sidetracked and you're not doing your test. Tell your parents you're taking a test. You'll come to dinner after your test is over. Just don't let yourself get distracted. I mean, I'm happy to delete attempts and have you start again. That's, fine by me. I become less happy to do it the longer you wait to take the test. When I get the email Wednesday night, the end of the grace period, and it's like 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, and somebody's emailing me asking me to delete your attempt, then I get a little touchy. I get a little testy. So just map out a chunk of time. That's just a good policy to be in general, because those of you returning to, it's your sophomores, so you're all returning to building next year, whatever building you're returning to. At this point, there are no online options unless you're doing MTDA. So you're going to have to get reused to taking tests within a time frame. So may as well get started getting used to that now. Don't forget to do the Week 12 discussion forum. Don't forget to do the seminar assignments. People are still, they do that news quiz, but then they don't do the journal. If you don't do the journal, that's 15 points. You're just leaving off your grade. And some of you need every stinking point you can get your hands on right now. So do everything. Speaking of that, I posted an extra credit opportunity in the course. It is an experiential kind of a thing. It is asking you to either go to a history type museum or you can visit one online, and I provided a list of ones that you can visit that I have URLs and whatnot, or you can Google them from the list. But you can do either one of those, or you can do 2 virtual ones and 1 of the in-person. You can do up to 3 of those visits. If you are doing live, one of our nice, really excellent local museums, understand that you need to not be a total jerk when you show up. If you end up as a part of a tour, you need to experience that tour. Okay, you don't get to bug out, 10 minutes in and be rude to some poor docent who's probably a volunteer. Honestly, you need to represent yourself and your school and this district and me well. If I get word back that my students were being obnoxious twerps, guess what? You don't get your points. So just be aware of that. And if you think that's going to be a problem for you, then maybe don't do the live in-person ones. Maybe do the virtual ones. That way, nobody really minds if you bug out after 15, 20 minutes. With the virtual ones, I do expect you to, really fully go through whatever section of that virtual museum that you're viewing. Please don't just click on it and go, oh, that's pretty, and leave. That's not the point. The point is to actually experience something. So make sure to read the instruction sheet that I've posted that is in this week's work, as well as at the top of the course underneath all the tutorials. That is also, at that top part is where you turn in your write-ups. And please, if you're going to do more than one, just put them all in one word processing document. Don't try and submit more than one document. I have enabled Google Drive submissions for this. Just make sure if you are utilizing Google Drive that you get a shareable link and just paste it into that Moodle, that online text form in that Dropbox. If your idea of submitting something from Google Drive is sharing it with me where it sends me that email, I'll delete that. Plain and simple. I've just decided I'm not trafficking in those anymore. You've got to submit an actual link. So you look for get shareable link, and that's what you paste in there. Make sure you modify the settings so that anyone with the link can view, or if you're using your GFPS Google Drive, it'd be anyone within Great Falls Public Schools can view. Okay, make sure to just set it as that. So much easier. You don't need to grant me editing access. I'm not going to edit your document. I do not have the time or inclination to go through and correct all of your spelling and punctuation and grammar issues. I'd spend the rest of my life doing it, and then 2 months in, I would just go insane. So don't share it with me. I just need to view it. That's all we need. Okay. There we go. And then last but not least, as I say every week, please join the Remind. If you're not on the Remind, you're missing stuff, like reminders about these sessions, like if I'm not going to be on for a session, I send that out on Remind. If you're not on the Remind, you miss that, and then you try and show up, and then you're emailing me. We don't have a session today? No, I put that in the Remind. Oh. So please join the Remind. All right. Any questions on any of that? All right. So we're going to talk about the rest of the Copper King stuff, and this is actually not going to take all that long today, which is good. But we're going to talk about F. Augustus Hines, Frederick Augustus Hines. I thought for the longest time, guy's first name was Fritz. I don't know why. I don't know where I got that. But speaking of people named Fritz, Walter Fritz Mondale, former vice president of the United States, just passed away this week. But I've thought that this guy's name was Fritz for so many years. I don't know where I got that. Anyway, so we're going to talk about the other Copper King, Fritz Augustus Hines. But first, last week on As the Copper Smelts. Dun-la-da, dun-la-da. We need copper so that we can electrify the world. I'll give you copper. I'll give you copper too. I don't like you. I don't like you either. Nyeh, nyeh. I want to be a senator. I'm going to keep you from being a senator. Nyeh, nyeh, nyeh. I'm going to bribe everyone. I'm going to bribe everyone too. Ha 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 ha. We're both rich. So as we continue talking about the Copper Kings, we get into the other part of the War of the Copper Kings. And this one only very minimally involves either of the guys that we were talking about last week. Now, this guy was a contemporary of them to a certain extent. But by the time Frederick Augustus Hines really becomes a big deal, Clark was a senator and Daly was largely dead. I don't know how one is largely dead. So Hines actually does come when these two guys were having their original war. He comes to Butte in 1889 to work as an engineer for the Boston and Montana Copper Company. So there were a number of copper companies in Butte. It was not just the Anaconda Company. It was not just later amalgamated. There were a number of copper companies operating in Butte, some of them larger than others. The Boston and Montana Company actually will later end up joining up with Amalgamated, and they end up changing the whole name back to Anaconda. So for a while, it's the Anaconda Company again, even though Daly is long dead. But it's actually the Boston and Montana Copper Company that end up building a smelter here in Great Falls. And so if you ever see old pictures of Great Falls, one of the things that I belong to a Facebook group called, it's like, Remember Great Falls When? And I swear half the posts are, remember the stack. I miss the stack. Okay, yeah, great. Never mind that it poisoned Black Eagle. Okay, I used to live in Black Eagle, and I couldn't grow vegetables in my backyard because the EPA came in and said, yeah, if you grow those, don't eat them. They'll poison you. Like, okay, no vegetable garden. And I had a huge yard, too. By Black Eagle standards, I had a massive yard and couldn't use it for anything. We could grow grass. That was it. Yeah, so that the Great Falls stack, which you see that in paintings, I mean, huge nostalgia thing, was built by the Boston and Montana Copper Company. Later was taken over after they consolidated with Amalgamated, and they then became the Anaconda Company. Then it was owned by the Anaconda Company. Daly's Anaconda Company built a smelter facility not in Butte, but just outside of Butte, and built a town for the workers of that that becomes known as Anaconda. And we talked about Anaconda last week. And if you want to see what one of those smelter type facilities looks like, you should definitely take a drive to Anaconda. Anaconda is beautiful in its own way. And you can still see, now you can't like go up to it or anything or go into it, but you can still see the darn thing. They can't dismantle it because there is so much heavy metal toxicity that it would basically poison everything in a 50-mile radius. So they can't take it down. And if it ever falls down, goodbye. But yeah, it's still standing. You can look at it and go, oh, that's pretty in an ugly sort of way. Yeah, so Hines comes to Montana, comes to Butte in 1889 to be a mining engineer. And remember that Daly sells his company to Amalgamated Copper shortly before his death. So 1899 is when that happens. Now, in the meantime, Hines was very young, very smart, and he is going to sort of parlay his experience and a little bit of inherited money, and he buys a small, he sets up a small smelter, the Montana Ore Purchasing Company, and that basically he's going to get copper from the smaller copper companies and smelt it in one location. And as he gets richer, he kind of starts buying up some of these little copper outfits as well. So in order to catch up to Clark and Daly and these other big players in the copper industry, incidentally, Clark still owned his interests in the Montana copper business long into his tenure in the Senate, and actually even after. He just never came back to the state after he was served in the Senate. But one of the ways that Hines was going to compete was Hines was going to position himself as sort of the people's copper king. The nice copper king, as it were. And one of the ways he's going to do that is he's going to voluntarily reduce working hours in his mines from 10 hours a day to 8 hours a day. At this point, the standard was 10 hours a day. Organized labor unions were fighting for an 8-hour workday. The idea was you should really spend no more than a third of your life working. You should have a third, basically 8 hours a day for work, 8 hours a day for rest, aka sleeping, and 8 hours a day to do with as you will. Okay. However, most industrial bosses wanted as much labor out of their workers as they could get, so they were still holding to this 10 or more hour a day working condition. Hines goes, you want 8 hours? Fine, 8 hours. And he actually paid relatively well. What this meant was that the miners of Butte didn't want to work for these other guys. They wanted to work for Hines. Hines used shorter hours. The pay basically equaled out. So he paid a little better for less work, and you're still making, roughly the same or better money. Heck yeah, that's a heck of a deal. So Hines kind of becomes a hero to his workers, and he goes and makes these big speeches around Butte, basically laying into Amalgamated Copper and how evil they were. But Hines wasn't done there. He actually used what was known as the Apex Law. So his mines were, kind of small time outfits. But he instructed his miners to follow veins of copper to wherever they originated, even if that meant digging into other people's mines. And he justified this by saying, well, the law says that we can follow the vein. And so this would get challenged because obviously his miners would end up in other people's mines, digging into other people's mines, and Amalgamated and these other companies would take Heinz to court, and Heinz would get these cases either thrown out of court, or more frequently, he would just tie them up. He would stall them. He did this, number one, he employed like 30 lawyers, which back then was huge. Nowadays, corporations having 30 lawyers, that's not unheard of. But back then, that was a massive amount of legal talent that Heinz had on the payroll to basically just tie up stuff in court, to keep things from moving through the courts, so that because he knew he was kind of in the wrong on this. But if he tied it up in court, that would give him time to pressure the judge into siding with him. And so he ended up helping get Butte judges appointed by bribing other elected officials who would appoint judges, like the governor, and getting the people that he wanted appointed to judicial offices who would then side with him. So he just made sure that that people friendly to him were in positions of power who could help him out. I mean, he was accused at one point of having a young woman offer a judge like $100,000 to side in a particular way in a case, but they couldn't actually tie him to this woman, even though, I mean, fairly plainly obvious that this woman didn't have $100,000 unless somebody gave it to her. And if you come on, it's Heinz. But yeah, so he ends up getting away with that. Heinz lived a fairly charmed existence for a time. He basically got whatever he wanted, even though he was young, and yeah. So Heinz takes on Amalgamated and really attempts to kind of disrupt the copper industry, again, by paying his workers better, by reducing their number of hours. Now, this wasn't still, copper mining was dangerous and god awful. It still wasn't like a great job. But his goal was to kind of disrupt this, even though he was kind of a small player. His United Copper Company, so he folds all of his interests into the United Copper Company, and they have a capacity of about 40 million pounds a year, compared to Amalgamated, 143 million pounds a year. So this was not a threat to Amalgamated in terms of capacity. But if Amalgamated couldn't get workers because the workers wanted to work for Heinz, then this had a potential to disrupt. So in 1903, using that Apex law, Heinz's miners moved down to follow a vein into an Amalgamated mine. They ended up taking 100,000 tons of high-grade copper out of the mine before they were stopped, and they weren't stopped until violence broke out. Both the Heinz miners and the Amalgamated miners they were throwing dynamite and they were fist fighting and all sorts of nasty stuff. The Heinz miners actually put caustic chemicals in the mine to keep the Amalgamated people out. I mean, there's practically war in the mines of Butte. So Amalgamated takes Heinz to court. This gets tied up in court, as it typically did. Heinz was good at this. And so Amalgamated decided, okay, we're going to nip this in the bud. And Amalgamated shut down all of its mines, its smelters, everything, shut down its entire operation. And basically said to the governor, you need to move our cases out of Butte. Heinz controls all the judges here. Not that Amalgamated didn't bribe people too. But basically, they said to Governor Toole, look, you need to settle this or we're not coming back. We're not reopening our facilities. And that's going to be a huge thing because Amalgamated was a major employer of people in this state. The city of Anaconda was at this point basically an Amalgamated company town. And Anaconda was a major town, unlike today where it's kind of a, podunk little nothing. So Toole was kind of forced to submit. He calls a special session of the legislature and basically says in his opening address, yeah, do this. I mean, you're not just legislating to help Amalgamated. This will benefit other people, but we got to do this or our economy is going to crash. So ultimately, Hines ends up losing. The cases are moved out of Butte. He loses. Now, the only reason Hines was able to compete against Amalgamated was the fact that he was bribing judges and local officials, and also the fact that he had played to the workers. He was actually relatively good on worker issues. And he was fairly successful in convincing people that Amalgamated was this evil Eastern corporation that just wanted to control Montana. But in the end, Hines is going to lose his court cases. And by 1906, Hines is going to be basically forced to sell his mine interests here in Montana to Amalgamated in a deal that was worth like $12 million at the time, which is a huge amount of money today. So Hines leaves Montana a phenomenally wealthy person. He does come back at one point so Hines sets up shop on Wall Street or right by Wall Street. His brothers were involved in the financial industry, and he still owned the United Copper Company. He just sold his mines in Butte. And he actually helped to cause a nationwide recession. This was known as the Panic of 1907. And I'm not going to go into all of the economic reasons for that, but basically his brothers tried to raise the price of his stock and then drop it in an effort to corner the market, and it failed. And so Hines got implicated in this. He ends up being found not guilty. I'm not sure about the brothers, but Frederick himself gets away with all of this. And he goes on. He's still kind of a hero in Montana for a time, but later his company kind of takes a turn and he ends up dying fairly broke and dies young, like 44 years old, of cirrhosis of the liver. The second thing I just wanted to bring up, and this isn't really a Copper King war per se, but this was Amalgamated was an Eastern company that in the East, the relationship between the company and its workers was a lot more contentious than it always was in Montana. Daly and Clark, granted, were not humanitarians. They liked to turn a profit, but they were reasonably accommodating of their workers. Hines outright, sided with workers and was an absolute hero. Amalgamated decided that their workers were easily replaceable, and that if they didn't like working for what Amalgamated was offering, they could just be let go, and they could always find people to replace them. So beginning in about 1900, Amalgamated started an effort to basically cripple the miners' union and the smelters union in Montana. And they did this by basically implanting people in the union, workers who sided with the company. And by the time a few years go by, those workers were now some of the people in charge of the union. So the workers were negotiating with the company for a raise. They had not had a raise in like 15 years, something like that. This kind of goes back to inflation. The price of things is always going up. Well, if wages don't go up to keep pace with that, then people aren't going to be able to buy as much. And that's going to hurt the overall economy. But if you're the owner of a company, you want to pay as little for labor as you can possibly get away with so that you make more money. That's kind of the goal of capitalism. So the workers wanted a 50-cent per hour raise, which today doesn't seem like a lot, but um, back then that was substantial. And the union leaders ended up settling for a 25-cent per hour raise, and the workers came to feel that the union was not really representing them, and it sort of came out that, yeah, Amalgamated was basically trying to break the union. And so by this point the union kind of split in two. You had the sort of leadership of the union that was loyal to Amalgamated, and then you had the rest of the workers that were like, "Hey, Amalgamated's trying to screw us over here," and that basically meant that Amalgamated could do whatever they want because the union couldn't sustain a strike. Because if the leadership didn't support the workers, then the workers could just be fired. It was just a bad situation. And then in 1912, Amalgamated issued what were known as rustling cards that basically said that if you had a card, you were able to work. If you didn't have a card, you couldn't. You were basically fired. And so they did not issue cards to anyone who was critical of the company or who was active in the sort of more stringent part of the union. And again, they got away with this because Amalgamated had successfully basically broken the union. And the union's not going to really recover until World War II, certainly until the 30s, but really until World War II, the unions don't fully recover in that area. So again, that's sort of Amalgamated versus the workers. All right, so that is what we're going to talk about today. Are there any questions about any of that? I know I went through it kind of fast, but at least it wasn't as much as last week. All right, so your journal topic. Tell me, how did Frederick Augustus Heinz try to disrupt the copper industry? So answer that in the Moodle. And if there are no questions, then I am going to allow you to be free. If you have something you want to talk to me about, hang out and we'll talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Maybe. Okay, I'm going to exit this thing. There we go. Still, it's posted if you need it.